Have you been dealing with hip mobility limitations like this? Let me show you an easy way to assess and improve your hip mobility with exercises. Rehab, welcome back to the channel. I'm Dr. Craig Lindell, and today I'm going to show you exercises you can do to improve your hip rotation mobility. The hip is a ball and socket joint consisting of the head of the femur, which you can see here, the blue part, which is the thigh bone, as well as the acetabulum, which is the socket in our pelvis. That's where the head of the femur sits. The hip joint has the freedom to move in all planes of motion. That's going to be flexion and extension, adduction, as well as abduction, and then internal and external rotation. In a closed kinetic chain environment, when our foot is in contact with the ground, our pelvis also has the ability to contribute to relative hip motion by our pelvis moving on our hip. If we're lacking mobility or control of motion between the hip and the pelvis complex, the mechanics of how our hip joint aligns during movement will be impacted. This can lead to hip pain and dysfunction, including conditions such as hip osteoarthritis, sports-related groin pain, and femoral acetabular impingement, or also known as FAI. In addition, if we're specifically lacking hip rotational mobility, this will lead to compensatory movement strategies at the lumbar spine. The most common compensation we will see is excessive motion at the low back during a forward or a backward fold. So how do we know if we have enough hip rotation or if our hip rotation is symmetrical? Try this test. Start by sitting on a surface where your legs can dangle freely. Make sure your thigh is parallel to the ground, scooting as far back as you can until the knee creases are touching the edge of the surface. Let's use my right leg as an example to begin with. Swing the left leg out of the way to make room for assessing the right side. To begin, we're going to look at external rotation. Swing your heel inward towards the midline of your body. Don't let your thigh elevate off the surface. We're looking for 45 degrees of rotation, which is about halfway up from being perpendicular to the ground. If you are unsure, you can use the inclinometer feature on your smartphone. For internal rotation, we are swinging the heel outward away from the midline of the body. Here, we are looking for at least 30 degrees of rotation. You may find that one motion is more limited than the other, or that you have a difference compared to the other side. So always make sure to do both sides and compare. So if you're presenting with less than 45 degrees of external rotation, you will benefit from the external rotation mobility exercises. If you're presenting with less than 30 degrees of internal rotation, you will likely benefit from the internal rotation mobility exercise. But before you jump to conclusions or begin the exercises, it's important to consider the total arc of motion here. Based on our bony anatomy, some of us will naturally have more mobility in one direction than the other. For instance, if you present with 70 degrees of external rotation, but only 20 degrees of internal rotation, your total arc of motion is still 90 degrees. Generally, this is plenty of rotational mobility to have at the hip, and you may not be able to gain a significant amount of more motion. It's also important to take into account your personal history. Did you play sports growing up? If so, what sport? We tend to see interesting differences between each side in individuals that play sports such as soccer or hockey. So perfect symmetry side to side is not necessarily the end goal for every person. The takeaway is to appreciate your external versus internal rotation mobility, compare side to side, understand your total arc of motion, and intervene if appropriate. Now, let's dive into exercises to get those hips moving. The first exercise will be hook lying internal rotation. You're going to lie on your back with your knees bent and feet flat. Now cross your leg over, hooking the heel to the outer thigh of the hip that you want to mobilize. Let the cross-legged fall heavy, pulling the stretching leg further toward the ground. You should start to feel a stretch on the front and on the side of the hip. Try not to let your knee extend and try to keep your low back grounded into the surface. This ensures that we're truly getting hip mobility and we're not compensating with low back or pelvic motion. This is a great introductory option since it's a mid-range position with fairly low stress and low pressure to the hip joint. An added bonus is that the assisting leg is going into external rotation. So if you lack mobility on both sides, you may be getting a stretch on the opposite hip as well. this is more of a static stretch. So take this time to focus on deep breathing, long exhales, letting your nervous system relax, especially if this position feels uncomfortable to relax with. Try 2 minutes twice daily to begin seeing some changes. The next exercise is immobilization, targeting the posterior hip musculature as well as the posterior capsule of the hip. Working on this is important because posterior hip musculature and capsular stiffness are associated with poor joint mechanics, something we refer to as arthrokinematics. Poor mechanics can contribute to compensations, which can ultimately lead to the dysfunctions that we spoke of earlier in this video. So for this exercise, get started in a hands and knees position. We're going to bias our weight towards the leg that we want to mobilize. It should feel like there's more pressure going through the knee and the thigh on that side. From here, we're going to shift our weight backwards, sitting deeper, as if we were going into a deep squat. To keep the target simple, you want to feel a stretch in your back pocket on that side. What's really great about this stretch is the ability to both target external and internal rotation during the rock back motion. Before sitting back, pivot the shin and foot inward to capture external rotation mobility, and you should feel a stretch on the back of the hip. Otherwise, you can pivot the shin outward for internal rotation mobility, feeling a stretch in the front of the hip and the side of the hip. This is a good progression to your hip mobility practice as it mimics weight bearing through the hip and takes us into deeper flexion ranges of motion. Typically, the position in which most of us will be lacking mobility or control of motion is this flexion position. This is definitely one of our favorites from the hip mobility program, which you can find through the Prehab app. If you're getting any sort of pinch in the hip rather than a stretch sensation, try adjusting your pelvic position. Tuck your pelvis more or less, like you're doing a cat-cow exercise. And does that change anything? Remember, we can create relative motion by not only moving our thigh bone, the femur, but also the pelvis on the femur. Being mindful of pelvic position during this exercise is very important. Now that we've got our nervous system to adapt to these rotation positions, and we've got that hip joint moving better in that socket, we want to own our newfound mobility. We're going to be activating our hip rotators in our end range positions with this next exercise. First, we will target external rotation. Get into a 90-90 position with the front thigh perpendicular to your torso and the rear thigh parallel to your torso. Adjust as needed for your body. Both knees should be bent to about 90 degrees. This will limit motion to the hip joint as much as possible. If this position is tough for you to sit in with a tall spine, use a cushion under your sit bones to create a riser and help to take you out of that deep hip flexion position. Keeping a tall spine, begin to fold your torso over the front leg. This will create deeper external rotation positioning. From here, push your shin into the ground, feeling an increased stretch on the back and side of the hip. Hold this for 10 seconds and see if you can fold forward a bit deeper after that. And I want you to repeat this process 3 times. Keeping the torso flexed forward, now try lifting the shin towards the ceiling. Chances are there may not be any movement happening, and this will be very difficult. That's okay, as we're in our end range position and our muscles are at a disadvantage here. But you should feel muscles working on the back side and outside of the hip. Repeat this 10-second hold 3 times. The intention is what matters. Next, we will target internal rotation. Now you will twist your torso towards the rear leg, creating deeper internal rotation stretch. From here, push your heel into the ground, feeling an increased stretch on the front side of the hip. Hold this for 10 seconds and see if you can twist your torso further after. Repeat this process 3 times. Keeping the torso twisted, now try lifting the heel towards the ceiling. Again, chances are there will be very little movement happening, and this is going to be very difficult. We are in our end range position, and our muscles do not have much space to work with. But you should feel muscles working on the front side of the hip. Repeat this 10-second hold 3 times. If trying to lift your shin with this external or internal rotation stretch is too challenging or discomfort, you can switch to a contract relax stretch that focuses on pushing your legs into the ground, followed by moving your body on your hips. That is step 1 of both of the things that we just went through. So try both and see which one feels better and which one you prefer. Personally, I like pushing into the ground and then relaxing and moving my body on my hip. So let's review. We need hip rotation mobility so that our femur can move appropriately within our hip socket. This mobility is important for optimal mechanics during activities such as squatting and forward folding, lunging, anything that you can think of with the lower body. Lacking hip mobility can increase stress both to the hip and low back due to compensatory movement strategies. And this is correlated with hip pain, low back pain, or degenerative conditions of the hip and injuries at the hip. So use the hook lying internal rotation stretch to introduce the hips to rotation positions. Use the quadruped hip mobilization to target dynamic hip rotation positions and improve body awareness of the hip and pelvis. And then use the 90-90 exercises to improve the control and strength of your hip rotation, letting you create long-term changes in mobility. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope some of these tips helped you out with your hip rotation mobility. Let us know if there's any other topics you'd like us to cover. Until next time, Prehab, see ya.
Oh, hey, you're still here. Thanks for watching the video and taking control of your health.
Make sure to smash that subscribe button and check out our other YouTube content.
And did you know that we have a website and an app that you can prehab your entire body? Be sure to check out the link in the description.